President Trump had never closed an airport before. But what happened in the skies over Alaska that morning changed everything. At Anchorage International Airport, passengers were just starting their day, checking in their luggage, grabbing coffee, and heading to their gates. None of them knew that they would become part of a story that would reach all the way to the White House. Deep in the snowy Alaskan wilderness, a flight was meant to show how dangerous flying can be when something goes wrong. It was the last flight out of Alaska. A chilly winter morning at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. One of those mornings when coffee steam danced in the chilly air and passengers rushed through the terminals, clutching their paper cups like lifelines. A Boeing 737 waited quietly at Gate 37. Like thousands of flights before, this one seemed completely normal. The plane gleamed in the morning sun, its fresh paint making it look almost new despite having already logged over 25,000 flying hours. The ground crew moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, carrying out their routine checks with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. What made this flight so special couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Hidden beneath the surface, beyond the reach of normal pre-flight checks, something was waiting to make this routine flight one of the most remarkable incidents in Alaska's aviation history. The weather that morning couldn't have been better for flying. The sky was endlessly clear, with only a few scattered clouds painting white brushstrokes on the blue canvas. The weather forecast predicted calm conditions the entire way to the plane's destination. But sometimes perfect conditions can be deceptive. As the passengers boarded, no one could have imagined that they would become part of a story that would change aviation safety protocols forever. They were regular people, travelers typing away on their laptops, families on their way to vacation. Everyone had their own reasons for choosing this flight. Little did they know that their decision would give them an experience they would never forget. In the cockpit, the flight crew carried out their standard procedures. The captain, a veteran of over 15,000 flight hours, and the equally experienced first officer worked harmoniously together. They checked weather reports, checked systems, and prepared for another routine flight from Alaska to New York. The maintenance log showed nothing unusual. The aircraft had gone through the scheduled checks and everything appeared to be in perfect condition. But sometimes even the strictest security protocols can miss the smallest detail. A detail that, under the right circumstances, could become something much more significant. As the engines revved up and their familiar whine echoed across the tarmac, there was no indication that this flight would be any different than the thousands that had taken off from Newark before. The ground crew gave their final signals. The pushback went smoothly and the aircraft taxied to the runway. The morning sun cast long shadows on the runway as the plane made its way to the departure point. Other planes moved around them in the carefully choreographed dance of airport traffic. Air traffic control cleared them to take off, and her voice crackled over the radio with the same seasoned professionalism she displayed on every departure. The takeoff run began normally. The engines responded with their usual performance as the plane lifted off runway 4L and flew gently over the Alaskan mountains. No one could have predicted what would happen in the next 47 minutes. The plane climbed steadily to 3,000 feet, then 5,000, then 10,000, cutting through the morning air with practiced ease. As the plane leveled off to cruising altitude, something began to change. It started so subtly that most passengers didn't notice at first, but in the complex systems of a modern airliner, even the smallest anomaly can be the first warning sign of something much more serious. Think about the last time you were on a plane. Have you noticed every little vibration, every little change in the sound of the engine? Would you have recognized the difference between normal flight characteristics and the first signs of trouble? For the passengers and crew of this flight, this difference soon became shockingly clear. What exactly was the first sign of trouble? Did this experienced flight crew's blood run cold? Something wasn't right. The first signs appeared 23 minutes after the start of the flight. A slight vibration, barely noticeable at first, began to sound on the starboard side of the aircraft. Most of the passengers had now immersed themselves in their everyday lives. Some were dozing, others were engrossed in books or tablets. But for the passengers on the right wing, this quake felt somehow different. High above the mountains of Alaska, the vibrations slowly increased. It wasn't the usual turbulence that frequent flyers were used to. There was a certain rhythm to this feeling, a mechanical pulse that seemed to whisper through the airframe. In the cockpit, The first instrument displays showed slight fluctuations in the performance data of the right engine. Nothing alarming yet, but enough to warrant closer monitoring. The flight data recorder later showed that the temperature inside the engine began to rise at a rate of 2 degrees per minute. This was slow enough not to cause an immediate alarm, but fast enough to attract the attention of the experienced flight crew. The pilots monitored their instruments with growing concern, noticing subtle variations in engine pressure ratio readings. After a few minutes, the vibration pattern changed. What started as a slight tremor had turned into a more violent tremor. The right engine's power output began to fluctuate, causing minor but noticeable speed fluctuations. In the passenger cabin, drinks swirled quietly in the cups and the window shutters rattled with increasing intensity. The warning system in the cockpit remained surprisingly quiet. Modern aircraft are equipped with sophisticated diagnostic systems designed to detect potential problems and alert the crew. Yet somehow this particular problem seemed to lie in a gray area. Serious enough to cause concern, but not serious enough to trigger automatic alerts. In such a situation, it became clear how valuable human experience and intuition are. The flight attendants also noticed this. Her trained eyes picked up subtle signs that something was wrong. The normal hum of the plane had taken on an unusual undertone, a discordant tone in the otherwise familiar symphony of flight noises. They exchanged knowing glances, their years of experience telling them that this was no ordinary turbulence. The onboard computers began recording irregular data patterns. The right engine fuel flow exhibited microscopic fluctuations, deviating from normal parameters by a fraction of a percent. Although these deviations were minor, they conveyed the picture of increasing mechanical stress. The engine's internal components were exposed to forces for which they were not designed, but the full extent of the problem remained hidden. The plane's location over water further complicated the situation. Standard procedure for engine anomalies usually involved a precautionary descent to lower altitudes. However, for operations over mountains, sufficient altitude was required for safety reasons. The flight crew had to balance these conflicting priorities while keeping an eye on the engine's ever-decreasing performance. Radio communications with air traffic control remained routine, but the crew had already begun discussing emergency plans. Their training emphasized the importance of staying ahead of the situation, preparing for multiple scenarios while managing immediate challenges. The behavior of the right engine suggested that time might be a critical factor, although no one could have predicted how critical it would become. Weather conditions remained favorable, which was a small blessing given the circumstances. The clear skies provided excellent visibility and the wind remained light to moderate. But even these favorable conditions could not hide the growing feeling that something momentous was brewing. The vibrations had become a constant presence, a constant reminder that this flight had deviated from routine operations. As the plane passed the 30-minute mark of its journey, the situation reached a turning point. The subtle warnings and minor anomalies were about to develop into something far more serious. The erratic behavior of the right engine had gone beyond simple vibrations and set the stage for one of the most difficult moments in Alaska's aviation history. The morning sun cast long shadows on the plane's wings, and in those shadows something would change dramatically. The flight crew's decades of experience had taught them to trust their instincts, and those instincts were now screaming at them that they were facing a situation they had never encountered in their training. What happened next tested the limits of both human ability and aircraft design, turning an unusual situation into something that would be studied in flight schools for years to come. At 36,000 feet above the ground, the true nature of their predicament would reveal itself in a way that none of the 178 people on board could have predicted. 36,000 feet above Atlantic City. The calm of the morning flight was shattered by a sound that cut through the cabin like a clap of thunder, the right engine cowling, a critical protective covering weighing more than 200 pounds. Began to separate from the plane's wing. The metal groaned and warped, struggling against forces it could not withstand. In an instant, the slight vibrations turned into a full-blown mechanical crisis. The sight shocked the passengers on the right side of the plane. The exposed engine components, now visible through the gap where the cowling had partially separated, were a frightening sight. The morning sun reflected off metal that should never have seen the light of day, casting eerie shadows on the surface of the wing. The engine itself began to shake more and more violently. its movements now clearly visible to even the most casual observer. At this altitude, the air temperature was approximately -55 degrees Fahrenheit, exposing the damaged engine to extreme conditions. The partially detached fairing caused aerodynamic disturbances that rippled throughout the airframe. These disturbances created new vibration patterns, each of which threatened to further compromise the engine's structural integrity. Flight data recorders recorded the rapid sequence of events. The engine's output varied widely, ranging from 85 to 97% of normal thrust. Each sway caused flaps to run through the airframe for passengers to fill in their seats. The plane's automatic systems struggled to compensate for the sudden changes in thrust and worked overtime to maintain stable flight. The cockpit was full of warning displays. Yellow warning lights illuminated on the instrument panel, accompanied by the urgent beep of multiple system warnings. The flight crew found themselves faced with an overwhelming amount of information while simultaneously piloting an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Their training had taught them the importance of remaining calm, but this situation tested their experience. The damaged engine continued to run, although each revolution of its massive turbine blades threatened to cause further damage. The lack of fairing exposed sensitive components to direct airflow, creating conditions for which the engine was not designed. Ambient noise in the cabin increased dramatically as the disrupted airflow created a deep, pulsating roar that penetrated even the aircraft's sophisticated soundproofing. Air temperature sensors around the damaged engine reported abnormal values. The exposed components, normally protected by the fairing's careful aerodynamic design, were now exposed to the full force of the altitude conditions. Warning systems designed to monitor engine temperatures were confused by the conflicting data, further complicating an already difficult situation. The flight crew initiated emergency procedures and completed their checklist with practiced precision despite chaos surrounding them. Every decision she made would have lasting consequences, and time was not on her side. The damaged engine still worked, but its condition worsened with each passing minute. The decision to shut it down completely or try to manage its flawed state weighed heavily on their minds. Ground radar tracked the plane's position as it began to slowly turn toward the coast. The turn itself presented new challenges as the aerodynamic forces acting on the damaged engine changed with the aircraft's orientation. The partial loss of the fairing affected the aircraft's flight characteristics in a way that no simulator could have prepared them for. The aircraft's position relative to emergency landing sites became a critical factor. The vast Alaskan wilderness stretched below them, and airports were few and far between. Fairbanks International Airport was too far away, and numerous smaller airfields dotted the landscape. But many were ill-equipped to handle an emergency of this magnitude. The crew faced a difficult decision. Try landing at one of the closer regional airports with limited emergency facilities, or try returning to Anchorage, where a full emergency response team is waiting. In Alaska's harsh terrain, where weather conditions can change in minutes and temperatures can drop well below freezing, choosing the wrong airport could have disastrous consequences. Calculating fuel consumption became more important as the efficiency of the damaged engine rapidly decreased. What began as a routine flight with normal fuel reserves now became an exercise in resource management. The crew had to take into account the increased fuel consumption due to the compromised aerodynamics while maintaining enough reserves for possible diversions or holding patterns. The flight data recorder continued to record unprecedented combinations of system alerts and sensor readings. The unique nature of the error caused some of the plane's automated systems to begin operating in ways their designers never expected. The interaction between these systems and the crew's attempts to stabilize the situation later became a focus of the investigation. As the aircraft held its position over the Alaska Range, the situation reached a critical turning point. The partially separated fairing was in danger of completely detaching, potentially causing catastrophic damage to other parts of the aircraft. The vibrations had reached an intensity that made normal cockpit operations difficult, and the crew knew their window of opportunity for decisive action was rapidly narrowing. The morning sun was now casting long shadows on the damaged engine. What began as a slight vibration turned into one of the most serious in-flight emergencies in recent aviation history. The next few minutes would not only determine the fate of this flight, but also affect the future of aviation safety regulations. Fight against time. At 36,000 feet, time became a precious commodity. With each passing second, the flight crew battled a complex web of challenges. The decision to initiate an emergency descent came after careful consideration. The aircraft had to reach a lower altitude where the air was dense enough to allow better control, but high enough to ensure a safe distance above the terrain. The descent itself brought new complications. As the aircraft began its controlled descent through the atmosphere, the damaged engine responded erratically to power adjustments. The missing fairing created unpredictable air currents that affected the aircraft's handling in a way the crew had never experienced. The autopilot, confused by the unusual aerodynamic conditions, had to be turned off, leaving the pilots to manually control the aircraft as it descended. Weather patterns that seemed insignificant at cruising altitude now took on new significance. There was moderate turbulence between their current position and their planned flight path. Each harsh air bubble threatened to put further strain on the damaged engine. The crew had to carefully make their way through the sky, using weather radars to identify and avoid areas of possible atmospheric disturbance. The plane's sophisticated flight management system began displaying a series of warning messages. The combination of rapid descent and asymmetric thrust resulted in conditions that pushed several systems to their operational limits. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel as various aircraft systems tried to adjust to the unusual flight profile. Radio traffic intensified as air traffic controllers cleared a path through one of the world's busiest airspaces. The complex network of flight corridors in the area had to be quickly reorganized to accommodate a distressed aircraft. Other flights were diverted, creating a protective bubble of free airspace around the distressed aircraft. The engine's condition continued to deteriorate. Metal fatigue indicators, designed to warn of structural stress, showed alarming levels. The partially detached fairing had triggered a cascade of mechanical problems that spread like a virus through the engine systems. Every minute of continued operation risks further damage, but the engine's remaining thrust is critical to maintaining controlled flight. Fuel management is becoming increasingly critical. The damaged engine's efficiency has dropped dramatically, consuming far more fuel than normal and producing less thrust. The crew constantly recalculated their fuel reserves, because every minute in the air reduced their safety reserves. The nearest suitable airport was now 23 minutes away, which is an eternity in an emergency situation. The plane's descent passed through layers of varying air density. Each change affected the already compromised aerodynamics around the damaged engine. The flight crew had to constantly adjust their control inputs and combat forces that threatened to divert the aircraft from its planned course. Her hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, making hundreds of small corrections to keep the flight stable. Emergency teams have been mobilized along the mountains of Alaska. Fire stations at 3 different airports prepared for possible scenarios because it was not yet clear which facility would ultimately accommodate the problem aircraft. Medical teams have been placed on standby to respond to any situation that may arise during the landing attempt. The flight management computer continually recalculated the aircraft's performance. The complex algorithms designed to predict the aircraft's behavior under normal conditions could barely account for the aerodynamic anomalies caused by the damaged engine. The crew increasingly had to rely on their training and experience rather than automated systems. As they descended to 15,000 feet, the thicker air brought both benefits and challenges. The higher air density allowed for better control, but also meant greater stress on the damaged engine components. The sound of air flowing around the damaged panel grew louder, creating a distinctive whine that permeated the cabin. The flight crew worked through their emergency checklist with methodical precision, preparing for several possible scenarios. Each point they worked through was a small victory against time, but the rapidly evolving situation meant they had to stay one step ahead of potential complications. From their training, they knew that the most critical phase of the flight was still to come. The calculations for their approach began to take shape. The reduced thrust of the damaged engine meant they needed a longer runway than normal. Wind conditions at different altitudes influenced their descent planning and forced them to constantly adjust their flight path. The crew had to balance the need for a quick solution with the importance of a stable, controlled flight path. The snow-capped peaks of Alaska grew larger in view as they sank 10,000 feet below. The weak winter light revealed the full extent of the damage as ice formed around exposed engine components. The vast wilderness below offered no comfort. Endless white plains and frozen forests stretched as far as the eye could see. What had begun as a routine flight over America's final frontier had turned into an aviation crisis that would not only be investigated for years, but would soon draw the attention of the president himself. The next phase would require all of their skills and experience as they prepared for something few pilots had ever faced: landing an airliner with badly damaged engine cowling and unsafe controls. The true test of their training and skills would begin as they entered the most critical phase of their emergency, the critical descent. The final approach to Anchorage International Airport came much earlier than planned. The plane never reached its intended cross-country destination, but this decision would ultimately save everyone on board. The flight crew had prepared the aircraft for an emergency landing in the harsh Alaskan winter and controlled the speed precisely despite the bitter cold. Too fast would have put even more strain on the damaged engine. If you drive too slowly, ice could form on the wings. Air traffic controllers blocked all traffic from Anchorage airspace and created an emergency corridor for the distressed aircraft, which had just begun their scheduled flight. Emergency vehicles lined the snow-covered runway, their lights piercing the dull winter morning. The search and rescue teams positioned themselves strategically, knowing that in Alaska's unforgiving climate, every second of response time counted. Extending the landing gear in sub-zero temperatures brought new concerns. The added drag from the extended landing gear and the fierce Alaskan winds made the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. They attempted this landing just a fraction of their planned flight path, but it was their only option. The aircraft rolled slightly to the right, requiring constant corrections from the flight crew. Descending to over 300 meters, the crew relied heavily on their instruments. The runway lights, barely visible through the swirling snow, were an important guide. Although they were still thousands of miles from their destination, they knew that returning to Anchorage was their only chance of survival. The actual landing required incredible skill in the treacherous conditions. Despite all odds, the flight crew managed a perfect landing and the huge aircraft landed on the icy runway with remarkable precision. They were only in the air for 47 minutes, but those minutes seemed like an eternity. President Trump's response was immediate and unprecedented. A few hours after the incident, he ordered the airport to be completely closed. What happened in Alaska was unacceptable, he said in a crisis press conference. But thank God they decided to turn back. These pilots saved hundreds of lives today, and we will make sure something like this never happens again. The ensuing investigation gained national significance. Teams of engineers, security experts and aviation specialists worked around the clock and their findings were reported directly to the White House. The partially detached engine cowling revealed critical weaknesses during cold weather operations, problems that had gone unnoticed during routine inspections. The president's intervention accelerated the federal authorities' response. If the plane had continued its journey, we could tell a completely different story today. Trump clarified that the new inspection protocols were developed quickly, with particular attention to aircraft operating in extreme weather conditions. The incident sparked a broader debate about aviation safety in America's most challenging environments. The president's administration pushed for comprehensive reviews of all major airports in extreme climates. We will have the safest airports in the world, he emphasized. What happened in Alaska will make every airport in America safer. The story of this aborted flight became more than just another aviation accident. While the quick decision to return to Anchorage was disappointing for passengers headed to the East Coast, it proved to be the difference between a near miss and a potentially catastrophic tragedy. As winter descended on Alaska, the airport reopened with newly implemented safety measures, setting a new standard for cold weather flight operations. The incident proved that sometimes the bravest decision a flight crew can make is to turn back, even if it means they will never reach their planned destination. The next time you board a plane, take a moment to appreciate the incredible system of safety and competency that keeps us soaring through the sky. This Alaska incident not only changed aviation, but showed us how challenges can turn into opportunities for growth and improvement. Every flight is safer today because we have had experiences thousands of meters above the breathtaking mountains. Did you enjoy this journey through the history of aviation? Like and subscribe for more fascinating stories that are changing the way we fly. Let us continue to strive for the skies together. See you in the next video.